We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
Hello and welcome to Planet Holyrood. I'm Paul Hutchin, political editor of the Daily Record, joined this week by John Ferguson, who's the editor of the Sunday Mail, and of course Ben Borland, the editor of the Scottish Daily Express. So, a single issue episode, I think, this week. We're a couple of days away from the 1 year anniversary of Labour sweeping to power and kicking out the Tories, which was a result warmly welcomed by the Daily Record. My take on Keir Starmer's first year, what would I say? There have been some good things. There was a big rise in the national living wage. It was the biggest boost to workers' rights in a generation. I think the budget did lead to big spending increases, particularly for the NHS, and some of the trade deals signed, I think, showed Keir Starmer in a good light. But to be honest with you, overall, it's been pretty disappointing. And I think that the first 12 months, there have been blunders, and the 12 months have been defined by the length of time taken to clean up those blunders, particularly on winter fuel payments and now on welfare cuts, where the initial proposal was to take money away from people who are disabled, and then that was partly unceremoniously dumped earlier this week. So, John, overall, as I've said, some decent things, but it's been a difficult first year and a mixed first year for Keir Starmer.
Yeah, I don't think that anyone in Labour would try to pretend that it's been the best start that a new government could get. If you think back to when Labour came into power, the talk was all about fixing the foundations and steadying the ship. You know, even then they were sort of trying to manage expectations in terms of what they could achieve. I think that even given those managed expectations, people feel that they're doing quite badly at the moment. But, you know, I think you're right to point to some really quite significant achievements. The boost to wages is a huge thing. I think you need to remember there was a lot of industrial unrest, or looking at doctors going on strike, all of that sort of stuff. They have managed to deal with a lot of those issues. There's things like the tax on private schools that I don't think we'd ever have saw a Tory government doing. I think that's a positive thing, but it's difficult to escape a lot of the sort of missteps that have been made. You feel almost that a lot of these things, presentationally, it's been a bit of a disaster. If, for example, they had just gone in with a policy that was rolling back the winter fuel payment a little bit, for example, saying that they would tax it so that the richer pensioners would effectively lose it, and poorer pensioners would retain that you know, they could probably have done that, got away with it easily. It's the same with the welfare changes. They've started off with quite a hardline position. They've then been forced to roll it back, and it kind of starts to look like the sort of constant U-turning that we saw from the Tories before them. So I think they were right to say when they came into power that there was a really difficult job. The public finances were in a terrible state, and that changes had to happen in terms of spending, and that there was in amongst that there was ways of making life better for people, and they've been successful in some of those areas, but presentationally just feel like they're not. There's a problem in that Keir Starmer just doesn't come across as a guy with a plan who knows his own mind and knows where he's going.
And John, I'll come to the inheritance in a moment. But at PMQs today, Kemi Badenoch laid into Chancellor Rachel Reeves. It appeared that Reeves started to cry. The explanation for this is that it was a personal issue. But again, the optics of that, the Chancellor who is embattled, people are calling for her head, people want someone else in the job, crying in the chamber, doesn't look good, does it?
No, I mean, I think you need to accept at face value. There could have been another reason for this, but yeah, the Chancellor of the Exchequer in tears behind the Prime Minister is not a good look. I mean, I do think that Rachel Reeves is being made to carry the can for a lot of things that clearly she was not the ultimate decision maker on. For example, winter fuel benefits, all these things. These were not decisions that were taken purely by the Chancellor. The Prime Minister was involved too.
Well, winter fuel is her mess, Well, but ultimately, all these missteps come back to the Treasury.
Do you really think that Rachel Reeves was the only independently made a decision to cut that, and that Kier Starmer didn't okay it? I mean,
I think it originated from the Treasury, but he signed it off. I don't think something like that would happen without the...
Well, I mean, in that case, the Prime Minister is responsible for every decision. She has to be, she has to carry the can for the two major cock-ups, and they've all been cash related. There's the benefits cuts and winter fuel.
Well, I mean, I think that's a fair point, but I guess ultimately, Ben, Labour came in and they inherited a country that was on its knees. The immigration system, asylum system were just a shambles. If it's your view that welfare is out of control, that's a legacy of the Conservatives. Taxes were at their highest level in decades. I mean, no wonder Labour have struggled in terms of the economy, given the absolute nightmare it was bequeathed to them by the Conservatives.
But the thing is, everyone says, we left this terrible black hole. It was COVID. It was the COVID pandemic, and then the war in Russia, and then global downturns that created this. It wasn't the Tories. The Tories were actually doing a good job of...
forgetting something. Liz Truss?
That was a minor blip.
A minor blip. Ripped about 30 billion out of the economy. The worst Prime Minister I think we've ever had. She's largely responsible for the mess with it.
She's not large. COVID is largely responsible, and Vladimir Putin they're the two main factors, in my opinion.
Look at the opinion polls, and the Tory poll rating nosediving is directly linked to Liz Truss. That wrecked their reputation. Of course, Partygate was damaging, but Truss was a disaster for this country.
She was a disaster, but disasters happen, and you've got to then move on and recover from them. Things happen all the time that damage the bond markets. The thing is, though,
a minor blip.
The thing is, you're saying this is the inheritance from the Tories, but Labour were in opposition all this time. They knew, and for most of it, knew that they were heading for power. But what planning have they done? They've come in with no plan. All this could have been war-gamed and strategized and set out. They had 5 years where it looked as though Keir Starmer was on course to become Prime Minister. And he becomes Prime Minister, and it's almost like it was a big surprise to him. None of their policies have actually been properly tested, and they just floundered through this first 12 months, when actually, had they prepared properly, so you can blame the Tories for what they did in power, but I think the bigger share of the blame is for what Labour didn't do while in opposition.
Yeah, they didn't prepare. And I think one of the main lessons of the last 12 months is this failure to tell a story, a positive story about where the country's going, what the destination is. And I mean, I thought there was a fascinating statistic on the BBC. It was from an Ipsos poll. I'll come to that. But I just want to contrast the first 100 days of Tony Blair with the first 100 days of Keir Starmer. So, first 100 days of Blair, we had the National Minimum Wage Bill introduced, referendums in Scotland and Wales, Good Friday Agreement signed, and also the Bank of England independent. None of these things were massively costly to the public purse, but all had a profound impact on the country. Everyone knew where Blair wanted to take the country. He might disagree with it, but he had a vision. And so this Ipsos poll that was on the BBC at the weekend, after 12 months, Tony Blair's approval rating was plus 34, and I think Keir Starmer's is minus 54. So those are pretty brutal numbers, John.
Yeah, it's pretty brutal. And I think you've got to look at the policies, but you've also got to look at the person who is delivering them. Tony Blair was a bit of a one-off, wasn't he? He was a very charismatic Prime Minister who had an ability to, as you say, tell a story. And it wasn't a particularly a left-wing story. He actually took the Labour Party away from the left and into a very centre position in British politics, but he could tell a story about why he was doing that, and he was able to take people with him, and you get the feeling that is one of the things that's lacking with Keir Starmer as much as the policy platform. And in fact, there's a strong argument that Keir Starmer has managed to take the country into a more stable economic footing, that he's continued a lot of those Blair legacies that you've spoken about, increasing the minimum wage. But the feeling is that he doesn't really have a direction of his own, and that over the last couple of days, what you're seeing is him now being sort of controlled by. There's a feeling that his MPs want to see a slightly more left-wing agenda, and that they are now forcing that on him rather than him making that decision.
I think that one of the key takeaways from the first 12 months is stop taking money away from people in low incomes or even modest incomes. Taking money away from pensioners on 12 grand a year, taking money away or trying to take money away from disabled people who are on benefits. And even under the plans originally proposed, people who should be on benefits would have had their money cut. I just feel like we're in this spiral of decline, of this constantly looking for tax rises and public spending cuts because of the fiscal rules that Rachel Reeves clings to. And if Rachel Reeves had been Chancellor in 1945, I think she would have said, we're not going to create a National Health Service because it would breach our fiscal rules. or we're not going to have a welfare state because, we're not going to borrow for day-to-day spending. Just this lack of ambition that we've seen over the last 12 months. I think the Labour Party does have some good ideas. There were good ideas in the manifesto, but just the combination of a lack of a story and having your hands tied by quite conservative fiscal rules has put them into a dark place. And you can see that in the opinion polls, where their poll rating is way down from last July, and they're struggling.
I will just point out, though, before we go too far along the lines of hero worship for Tony Blair, that ultimately he led the country into an illegal war and basically set the tone for the century ahead, which has been one of constant strife and conflict, and basically upended the entire Middle East because of his own ego and his own inability to stand up to George Bush. So Tony Blair may have had a good start, but he certainly didn't end very well. And you could argue possibly that Keir Starmer's a more moral person than Blair.
I think he's been excellent on the world stage. I do think he's come across like a statesman. The trade deals, I just think he comes across, as you say, as a decent, rational, sane person who wants to do well. And I think, but I spoke to, maybe mentioned this in an earlier podcast, I spoke to a relative, and I did say that I thought that the Prime Minister had done well globally, but my relative said, well, how about domestically? And that's where the problem comes in. People back home have to feel like they're better off, and the cost of living crisis is in the past. And right now, that's not the case.
Is he really doing that well globally? There's quite a strong argument that he's continuing Tony Blair's legacy of being dragged into illegal wars on the back of American foreign policy. We're talking about how Labour are doing it at the moment. I thought it was quite interesting it wasn't that long ago when Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party that he appeared on the main stage at Glastonbury, and people were chanting, "Oh, Jeremy Corbyn." That is not the chant that was being led from the stage this time round in relation to Keir Starmer. I think that a lot of people are very upset about the sort of decisions that Keir Starmer's taken internationally, and
I think I'd rather get booed at Glastonbury.
Yeah, I don't think Glastonbury is a representative sample of the British population. I think.
Do you not think it's quite representative in terms of the issues that were on display there?
Overprivileged toffs.
So you don't feel that the UK government is out of step with public opinion on Gaza? Because I think that's
I don't think we are. No, I think the silent majority is backing Israel on this.
Really?
Yeah.
That's not what all of the opinion polls that I've seen would suggest.
I don't think people are on Hamas's side in this war. I really don't.
I think the average person would want
I think the
Israel and
average person wants
Palestine to get around the table and actually stop fighting and try and hammer
I
out
don't
a
think
peace
the
deal.
average person agrees with that idiot Bobby Villan, and I don't think they agree with Kneecap. I think
that most people feel that there's very serious war crimes being committed in Gaza, and that for some reason the British government feels unable to fully condemn them and to stop assistance for the Israeli military. I think that's certainly all of the opinion polls that I've seen would suggest that that's the case. Don't know which ones you've been reading that make you think something else.
Well, I've studied the opinion polls just from people I speak to. I mean,
who have you been speaking to?
Tory
MPs,
ordinary people who remember that Hamas started this. We should not be on the side of an Iranian-backed terror organization. We should be.
60,000 people dead, possibly. Your latest report say it could be hundreds of thousands. You get missiles being launched into cafes.
I'm not saying that Israel haven't.
Nobody's saying what Hamas did was in any way acceptable, but the response is, you're seeing something very dark and ugly, and I think most decent people are looking at it and they're genuinely bewildered as to why the government seem unable to fully condemn this. And I think it's having an impact just in the same way that ultimately Tony Blair was very damaged by his foreign policy and inability to decouple himself from America. I think the same thing's happening with Kier Starmer.
Is it damaging him though? I mean, I think that there is huge anguish about what's happening in Gaza and the actions of the Netanyahu government. But I go back to the point that I think people, the average voter, is more focused on domestic issues than international issues. I think if you were to speak to folk, it'd be things like energy bills, council tax, inflation, and
ultimately it wasn't for Blair, was it? Ultimately, it was these international issues that.
Well, to be on a point of fact, I think the invasion of Iraq was 2003. It was immediately apparent that there were no weapons of mass destruction. There was then a general election in 2005, and Blair won it pretty comfortably.
But this is it. It takes a long time. And John, you might be right. It may be that we'll look back and go, this was wrong. I think we'll also look back and say Hamas could end this war any time they wanted. They could release these hostages and end this war, and could have done at any point in the last 18 months.
I mean,
they could. It's just a fact.
I mean, there's people
they could end the war today.
People queuing up for food being shot. That you can't. There's someone that's blamed for that, and it's not Hamas.
The next election is not going to be determined by what's going on in the Middle East. I mean, it's just, regardless of what your view is, Gaza is not going to be the key issue. It's going to be cost of living. It's going to be money in people's pockets, and I think that is Labour's key weakness just now. Folk want to see an end to the cost of living crisis. That's not happened. They don't see the light at the end of the tunnel, and I think the window of opportunity for getting that right is closing.
Yeah, I mean, they need to. It's very difficult to see what they can do now to turn things around. I think that it's quite likely that we will see some head rolling on this. It feels like someone's going to have to go, whether that's Morgan McSweeney, the Prime Minister Chief of Staff, well, it's Reeves, the Chancellor. You get the feeling that there's going to have to be a bit of a shake-up. But I think
Do you think Reeves will still be Chancellor by the end of the year?
I don't know. I think you wouldn't want to put money on it, would you? It feels unlikely at the moment. But the question is, what does someone coming in change?
They're a team, though. Starmer and Reeves are a double act. Much like Blair and Brown, they are tied together. So if Reeves goes, Starmer's almost.
I mean, he's shown in the past that he has got a ruthless streak.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that is the key thing. If he believed that a second term would be facilitated by a new Chancellor, then I think he would go for it.
The point is, because of these two U-turns, there's going to be tax rises in the budget. So the new Chancellor comes in knowing that they're going to have to punt through a load of tax rises.
Well, unless they
talk about a poison chalice of a job.
Unless they loosen the fiscal rules on borrowing. If they don't do that, then again they're back to this awful choice of raising taxes or cutting.
But again, to go back to what John was saying before, Starmer ultimately is Reeves' boss. He signs all these off. The fiscal rules aren't something she's introduced without his authority. So a new Chancellor comes in, rips up the fiscal rules. Where does that leave Starmer? He's just completely.
I mean, it's easy to say rip up the fiscal rules. Basically, what you're talking about is printing money, and that causes inflation. It's not the rules. Changing the rules doesn't just mean that you're breaking the rules. It has other consequences. At the moment, we're spending incredible number of billions servicing our debt, and you're talking about increasing that debt at a time that inflation is certainly nowhere near as low as it used to be and could increase at any time. So there's no easy solution to this.
I think, you could go and she could be replaced by someone who is loyal to Starmer. Wet streeting, perhaps, another Blairite, someone who's going to continue.
Pat McFadden, maybe.
Pat McFadden.
Here's the feeling that West Streeting would potentially prefer the top job himself. He's quite happy to sit in their health and to potentially go for the top job at some point that becomes available.
I mean, do you think Starmer survives? We've kind of come full circle. I remember saying in January saying I didn't think he was going to survive.
Well, you can see last week we were getting close to sort of votes of no confidence territory and all of that kind of thing. It's not impossible, is it, that it looked pretty desperate. You could see even on Friday, Saturday, that it was back of a fag packet stuff, the concessions on benefits that was clearly not going to. I think it still looks kind of unworkable, the idea that you're going to say to some people, you can keep these benefits, we agree you're disabled, but all these other new claimants there, you're not disabled. It's, it
not disabled enough. You're a new claimant. So.
Yeah, it doesn't make much sense. So I don't think he's out of the woods in this.
Not. On the other hand, something has to be. We can't just keep adding people onto the benefits and disability benefits bill. I mean, there are far too many people, I would argue, on claiming disability benefits who could be working or who actually don't need them. And if they can't be bothered working, then they shouldn't be getting a handout from the state. That's not to say that there aren't. The majority of people are, rightfully in receipt. But
a rise that took place on the Tory watch.
Yeah. I'm not saying that everything the last government did was that impressive. But
did they do anything that was impressive?
But the point is, again, just to go back, Labour had all this time to draw up their own plans and didn't do it clearly.
I think if you're looking at it from a Labour perspective, I think the concern is that you look at Biden beating Trump, comes in, he's a centre-left president with a centre-left agenda, fails on things like inflation, cost of living, immigration, and then the right sweep back to power 4 years later. And so, unless there are marked improvements and people feel those improvements, my concern is that we're on a motorway with no exit to Farage as Prime Minister. That is the concern, and I think that's backed up by the opinion polls, because the Tories look to be dead and buried. I do not think there's any chance that Badenoch is going to be the next Prime Minister. It's going to be whoever is leading Labour at the time or Nigel Farage. The Tories are going to come third.
I don't know. I think Robert Jenrick looks like a good leader in waiting. I mean,
is he not just a third-rate chance?
I think there's got to be a long period before people forget that the Tories were in power for so long, and during this period, Reform looked like the opposition. I do think by the time the next general election comes around, the Conservatives, I suspect, with a new leader, possibly even a third new leader, will still be there.
I cannot imagine the Conservatives getting their act together over the next 3 years. I think they'll be back. They're old political brand. They will always be back. But I think in terms of the next election, you're dead right. This is going to be between Labour and Reform, and Labour need to really start thinking about that now, because there's a high likelihood that we would be seeing the unthinkable thing of Nigel Farage walking into number 10 unless they can come up with some good policies that people really feel are making their lives better.
I mean, I think the split on the right might be Labour's big chance in terms of re-election.
Yeah.
Just allowing the Tories and Reform to fight it out on the right wing of UK politics, and Labour just focus on being Labour. Maybe with the exception of immigration, where I do think the country has moved to the right, if they can show progress on the boats and cutting net migration. But apart from that one issue, just an unashamedly Labour agenda. And I think they would command about 26% of the vote.
Stop taking money off of poor people, and if the economy does all right over the next few years, then Labour can definitely win. But it's going to be really difficult. I think that the next general election is going to be, well, look what you saw in America, and it's going to be a similar thing, isn't it? There's going to be a extremely populist campaign from Reform, where they're offering to nationalise things and give people extra money at the same time as cutting immigration to zero and cutting every kind of environmental policy that there is. So it's going to be a very difficult landscape to manoeuvre in for Labour.
I mean, I do think there is a path for Starmer to get re-elected. I guess the question for us, given that we focus on Scottish politics, is there a path for Anas Sarwar to become First Minister at the next election? I mean, I looked at some of the opinion polls, and 10 months before the general election, I think that Labour were regularly about 20 points ahead of the Tories. We're about 10 months away from the next Holyrood election, and Labour are about 11 behind the SNP. Now, that can change, but the dynamic is completely different. And I think that 11-point gap between Labour and the SNP is pretty much on Starmer. I think it's their slow start that has triggered this massive fall in support for Scottish Labour. And unless there is that marked improvement in London, I think it's Anas Sarwar who's going to suffer.
Yeah, it's going to be, I think you're right to say that the Scottish election is going to be largely determined by what's happening in London. But I think that Anas can do a lot to increase his chances, but ultimately, if people feel that Labour is failing them in Westminster, they're not going to vote for Labour in Scotland. I mean, I think you could see it's just so closely related that, John Swinney is not an absolute genius. His bounce when he became First Minister was all to do with Labour doing badly. Labour seemed to be doing a bit better now. They had the victory in the by-election, but the truth of that by-election was that there was three parties who all got very similar amount of votes. And if Labour over the next year are seen to be U-turning, flailing, taking money off of pensioners, taking money off disabled people, that's a disaster for Labour in the Holyrood election.
Yeah, I mean,
I think if the SNP get back in, there's an argument for saying devolution's failed, because
if they get back in, that's because the people of Scotland have put them back.
How can a party that has performed so badly, driven so many public services into the ground, keep getting re-elected on the basis that a different government isn't doing very well? It's nonsense.
I do think it's as simple as that, because there will be policies. There are policies that the SNP have delivered since 2007 that are popular. I may not agree with them, but they are.
But I mean, just to go back, so I noticed you quoted Tam Dalyell earlier with the motorway with no exits. He was famously against devolution and said, look, this is just leading to Scottish independence, and there's no way to stop it once we get on that motorway. Obviously, it's another thing that Blair delivered that now looks in
Tam Dalyell was wrong.
In hindsight, well, it wasn't totally wrong. It looks like it's a motorway that just delivers permanent one-party governance for Scotland.
Well,
because
if it was a motorway to Independence 106, it's a pretty long motorway.
Well, that's what I mean. But it's the ultimate destination is you can't get rid of the SNP. How badly can they do? And they still
you'll get rid of the SNP when people stop voting for them.
But they're only voting for them because they don't like what Labour are doing. It's a gift to the SNP.
Well, look, you're right about
they're only voting for the SNP because they don't like what Labour are doing.
No, they're not only voting. Look, the NHS is on its knees. The education system is a shambles, and key public services, as you say, and that is on the SNP. But there's another side of it which you have to take into consideration when you're looking at why people vote SNP. You got low-income families getting the Scottish Child Payment. You've got working parents and non-working parents getting all that free childcare, and then of course you've got free prescriptions, free higher education. You don't have to agree with those policies, but you have to recognise that they are popular, and that's part of the reason why the SNP keep getting re-elected. It's not simply a response to whichever government is in London. That's part of it, but it's not the full story.
No, but all these policies are only possible because the Treasury gives such a generous block grant to the Scottish government.
Devolution's been a success. It's been a success. I mean, I don't think anyone can look at the government in Edinburgh or the Parliament in Edinburgh and say, "Oh, it's way worse than the Parliament in London." I mean, I think government in London in the last 15 years has been an absolute shambles. It made this country an international laughingstock. The idea that we call for the Scottish Parliament to be abolished.
Why are we an international laughingstock?
Look at Brexit and the damage that's been inflicted on the country.
Do you genuinely not think that your average Scottish person doesn't look, when they think, who is my government, they don't look to the Scottish government increasingly as... and for good reason. It's because they are actually running things. Or you could complain about the way they're running things, but devolution has been a success in the sense that people see the Scottish government as their government, that their MSP is the person who's their representative in it.
I think some people who are switched on do. I think generally people think Westminster run things. Because the SNP, when anything goes wrong, the SNP blames Westminster. When anything goes well, the SNP takes credit. It's a game that has been set up, and the rules are so skewed because the SNP can never be the UK government. So they can always either take credit or deflect blame as the circumstances allow.
Sounds like you might be making an argument for independence. Just you're going to have to cut one of those governments.
I'm more making an argument for abolishing Holyrood. I think
it's a ridiculous argument. Look, we've got two struggling governments. That doesn't mean to say that you abolish the institution of the Parliament. What you do is you vote for another party to get a better government, and that is something that has been available to the Scottish people since, I think, 2011. And they've chosen not to. They've chosen to put the SNP in. The issue is that pro-UK parties have not put forward a positive alternative that has been appealing to the average Scottish voter. They've been very poor. And 10 months before another Holyrood election, I think the onus is on Labour to raise their game on policy and to have a manifesto that excites people. Simply saying that everything that the SNP's done since 2007 has been terrible. I've heard that tune before. It doesn't work. And if that's all the opposition parties have got to say, you're looking at a fifth-term SNP government.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say since 2007. I would say since probably 2011. I mean, the first Salmon government, supported by the Conservatives, did a lot. I mean, we're still... All the policies that you say are popular go back to then.
Well, I think one of them and the childcare, I think, are Sturgeon.
Yes, yeah.
And also I think the reason people will continue to vote for SNP in quite large numbers is because they feel those policies would be under threat if someone else
I would argue the main driver for and this, I totally respect this viewpoint. I understand it. I get it. I probably, like you say, keep making the argument for it inadvertently. The main reason for voting for the SNP is because you want an independent Scotland. It's not because you think they're doing a good job and, giving out loads of extra benefits. The number one reason for voting for the Nats is because you're a Nat. That is just a fact. And that's kind of...
it's one person, one vote. I mean, you can vote for whichever party for whatever reason you want. That's just a simple fact of life. All right, that was lively and enjoyable, but we'll have to wrap it up there. Thanks again to John and to Ben for joining me. You can listen to this episode of Planet Holyrood on Spotify or Apple Music, or watch it on the Daily Record YouTube channel. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and TikTok for the latest news and the best bits of the podcast.
We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.